today's IEO webinar. My name is Nicoletta Batini. I'm the lead evaluator of the IEO. Today's webinar is going to be on artificial intelligence, economic, social, and trade impacts. And we're going to have a conversation with Professor Daron Acemoglu and Professor Gary Marcus. And just a couple of words on, you all received the abstract, and I think that's why you're here. And we welcome you very much. The topic of artificial intelligence is very hot today. There's almost an AI hype going on, and you find it, discussed on newspapers, books, and Professor Acemoglu has actually written a book that talks about this, and we'll go to that in a second. But basically, is the ability of computers, machines to perform complex tasks, including thinking, seeing, acting, and speaking. And the work on artificial intelligence, as our speakers will tell us today, has started a while back. There were founding fathers of this discipline, and today it has advanced tremendously. And there's a belief that AI can help humans do things faster, sometimes in a more accurate way, and improve, like all machines, our quality of life. But on the other hand, there are serious concerns about AI because the way, and I think they will explain it in detail, current AI works in some of its denominations. It's actually very akin to a black box because it works often on a machine figuring out decision or actions based on probabilistic distributions. And a lot of times, sometimes things go wrong, and AI machines are said to hallucinate. They go sort of completely off rail. And since AI, the inventors and those that innovate in this field are thinking and already using it for a number of disciplines which have a very direct impact on human life. This can be dangerous. And so today's webinar will discuss whether AI can be made safe and positive for humanity, and we can regulate it in a way that, we can only take the benefits of it and not the very great risks. Some people say that AI might actually cause complete human extinction. So we're talking about, very serious issues here, not just like small problems. And the questions that we have for the speakers is, what is the role of governments and perhaps of the IMF and other international organizations in making sure that we don't rush towards, a far west innovation, but we think carefully before we tread onto this, difficult and challenging path of protecting, human life and human freedoms, and all we treasure that we've created with our civilization. So I would like just to introduce our speakers, a few words. They need no introduction, but I'll do it nonetheless. Professor Daron Acemoglu is currently Institute Professor at MIT. He's the author of several books, including Why Nations Fail, The Origins of Power, Prosperity, and Poverty with James Robinson. The Narrow Corridor, State, Societies, and the Fate of Liberty, also with James Robinson, that was presented at the fund not long ago. And the most recent one that was published on May 18th, together with Simon Johnson, called Power and Progress, Our 1,000-Year Struggle Over Technology and Prosperity. The first 50 people that join this seminar will receive a copy of that book, thanks to the sponsorship, the very kind sponsorship of the Bank Fund Joint Library. His academic work has been published in leading scholarly journals, and his research covers many areas of economics, political economy, economic development and growth, human capital theory, growth theory, innovation, search theory, networks, economics, and learning. The second speaker is Gary Marcus, who is Professor Emeritus of Psychology and Neuroscience at New York University. Gary is known internationally for his research on the intersection of cognitive psychology, neuroscience, and artificial intelligence. And in 2014, he founded Geometric Intelligence, which is a machine learning company. And he's widely published, including a book for which we provide a link in our LinkedIn page, titled Rebooting AI, Building Artificial Intelligence We Can Trust. On March 9th of this year, Gary and other researchers have signed an open letter calling for a moratorium on the training of AI systems more powerful than GPT-4 until proper safeguards can be implemented, primarily citing the short-term risks of mediocre AI that is unreliable but widely deployed. I would like, without further ado, to pass. Hi, Gary. I see you there. You've joined. Hi, very much welcome. I would like to. The way it's organized is that Daron will talk for 15 minutes or so, and then Gary will talk, and then we'll make it a little bit interactive, and we would like to also get questions from the audience, which has now reached 220 people. So let's start with Daron. Daron has some slides, and I'm going to pass the mic and the stage to you, Daron. You're welcome.
Thank you very much, Nicoletta, for organizing this event, for this wonderful introduction. It's a true pleasure for me to be here to talk about these issues, which I think are really important. And it's a double pleasure to share the stage with Gary Marcus, one of my favorite AI and neuroscience researcher colleagues, I guess, broad in the sense of broad collegiality. So it's really great that I have an opportunity to do so. So let me share my slides and get started. And I don't know why this went to the beginning end of it. Okay, all right. So I'm really looking forward to this conversation, and I conceived of this as a conversation. So some of the topics that I want to cover, I have left to the discussion section because I think they're going to come up. So instead, what I want to use my 15 minutes is to make a case that we need to rethink how we are using AI. And this is, of course, topical because of the heightened promise of AI, or as Nicoletta said, hype of generative AI. The promise of truly intelligent, flexible, easily usable complementarity to humans is really pretty exciting. And if it can do so, it can generate a lot of social good, economic productivity, and perhaps other societal outcomes. The question is whether this aspiration is a reality and what it depends on and what the constraints on it are. What I'm going to argue is that there is a true promise, but right now it's very unlikely to be realized for a number of very well-defined reasons for which we can actually learn a lot from the recent past. And I think one aspect of understanding where AI is going and where it could go is to distinguish, of course, simplifying things, is to distinguish two very different visions of what machines, especially digital machines, are about. One that goes back to Alan Turing or the Dartmouth Conference project on AI in 1956, is the view that machines can be designed to be autonomous and intelligent, smarter and more powerful than at least most humans. So this is the vision of machine intelligence. The word machine intelligence already has a huge amount of meaning embedded in it. But this is not the vision, and I think there's a very different, separate, and powerful vision as well, which let's call it a more pro-human vision, where machines are there not to be intelligent, not to be autonomous, but to be complementary to humans. I associate this, perhaps you can trace it back to Edgar Allan Poe, but I associate it with Norbert Wiener, never overlap with him, but I'll call him a colleague as well at MIT, J.C.R. Licklider, Douglas Engelbart, all of whom made both philosophical and actual technological contributions to a huge number of areas of computers, especially in the case of Douglas Engelbart. Now, why is it that this second vision is important to think about, especially in this moment of generative AI? And here is one perspective, which, again, simplifying things, but if you think of human activity, for much of our existence until about the 1800s, or perhaps a little bit before, at the beginning of the British Industrial Revolution, a lot of economic activities are about food production. You have very important ideas, very important tools, but they are limited by the range of economic activities that humans are performing. Then from 1800s to the middle of the 20th century, you have the growth of industrial production. This involves the application of scientific knowledge to many aspects of our lives, but part of this is again constrained by the limited ways in which human activities are organized. Big breakthroughs in industrial production, but it's industrial machinery and some complementary machinery to that really where the big action is. So for a variety of reasons, the last 60 years, 50 to 60 years, is seeing a acceleration in what you can call growth of knowledge work: design, education, entertainment, healthcare, writing, management, planning, programming. And these are set to become the predominant economic activities that most humans in the industrialized world are going to perform. Generative AI is one of the approaches that we can use for providing complementary tools in these knowledge work activities. This is, in fact, something that J.C.R. Licklider foresaw 60 years ago when he was talking of human brains and computing machines being coupled together very tightly, and the resulting partnership will think as no human brain has ever thought. He wasn't talking of chips being implanted into people's brains. He was thinking of better machines becoming part of human cognition, better decision-making, information filtering, retrieval, curation, and performance of creative tasks. So is that a possibility? Again, if you are an optimist, you can find bits and pieces of evidence which suggest that it is. So, for example, there are already papers showing that generative AI via GitHub Copilot can improve programming tasks by providing drafts and other inputs into programmers. Work by two of our students at the MIT Economics Department, by Shakat Noy and Whitney Zhang, shows through a controlled experiment that workers who are given access to ChatGPT become better at some simple or mid-level professional writing tasks. They take much less time, as this figure here on the left shows, and the quality of their output, as graded by other participants, increases. And in fact, the whole distribution shifts to the left, especially low-performing workers are doing better. A very interesting paper by my former colleague, Erik Brynjolfsson, and Danielle Lee and Lindsay Raymond from the Sloan School at MIT shows that a human complementary way of using ChatGPT in customer service by providing background information improves failure rates and increases service quality. These are very inspiring at some level, but I would actually argue that they are not easy to scale up. And in particular, there are going to be 4 major roadblocks on the way of using generative AI in a way that's good for human decision-making and human economic activities. These are automation, unforeseen consequences or systemic consequences or equilibrium consequences of better information for humans, platform control over information and how platforms use, and the fourth one, which is most speculative, but I think certain big barriers in cognition differences between algorithms and humans. And I'll argue that each of them are currently formidable barriers, but in each case we can learn a lot from why they have become barriers from past digital technologies, and perhaps about some ways of overcoming them. So on the first one, automation is a very different way of using machines. And in fact, the first vision, if machines are autonomous, intelligent, why not use them instead of humans? In fact, this is not very different from many digital technologies being used for automation or for information control over the last 4 decades. And I would say that the consequences of that have not been great. And I'll try to explain what those consequences are in 2 slides. This one here shows a macro picture by depicting what has happened to wage structure and earnings in the United States, where most of many of us are located. And it's indicative of broader trend in the industrialized world. I'm showing the evolution of real wages for 10 demographic groups, in each case normalized to 0 in 1960, so you can trace out the overall cumulative changes. And those are distinguished by gender, men and women, and by education, starting all the way from workers with less than a high school degree in red and to workers with a postgraduate degree in dark blue. From 1963 to the mid-1970s, you see a pattern that also was the case in the 1950s of shared prosperity. Real earnings for all 10 of these demographic groups are growing in tandem. Actually, the lines are on top of each other, and they're growing very fast, about 2.5% a year in real terms. From around 1980, in the digital age, you see a completely different picture, much greater inequality, and even more worryingly, sort of wage stagnation and declines in the real earnings of low education groups. Those without a high school degree, or even associate degrees, as shown in gray, are actually losing out quite a bit of real earnings. This seems to be very much associated with digital technologies. In fact, my work with Pascual Restrepo argues that a lot of this is explainable by the way that we have used digital technologies, including robotics, for automation. So to make that in the most succinct way, let me summarize that with the figure on the right, which is sort of related to the one that I showed you, but it's now looking at more detailed demographic groups rather than just age and education. Sorry, rather than just gender and education, I'm also looking at ethnicity and age. And the color coding here shows the education of the relevant demographic group. On the vertical axis, I'm giving a summary measure of what happened to wages from 1980. So the cumulative change, the overall change from 1980 to 2016. And you can see from this that many groups are below the zero line here, which means that they are actually losing out in terms of real earnings, as I suggested in the previous graph. And the key here is the horizontal axis, which is our estimate of what fraction of tasks that a demographic group used to perform in 1980 that have since been automated. And the figure shows a remarkable fit. The more automation a demographic group has experienced, the lower are their relative earnings. And in particular, almost all of the demographic groups that have suffered significant real wage declines are those that have been at the crosshairs of a lot of automation. Pascual and my work also shows that a lot of this, you can think of it as so-so automation. It has improved productivity, but not enormously. So it's the distributional effects of automation that have been much more major than the productivity gain. So that's what we have from the past, and it does create some concerns. And it's not like you don't have to go back to the 1980s, 90s, or 2000s. Pre-generative AI seems to follow a similar pattern. In another paper with David Otter, Pascual Restrepo, and Joe Hazel, we've looked at which are the establishments that have adopted AI up to 2020. And it is driven by this green and the blue curve, which are the establishments that have most tasks that can be replaceable by AI. And productivity effects are a bit harder to estimate, but there is at least bits and pieces of evidence that a lot of it is disappointing, like self-checkout kiosks that don't work very well, or customer service that is not truly intelligent or capable of achieving the things that were promised. Now, of course, if I'm showing you the bad, what is the good? The better AI here is truly human complementary. But what does that mean? So for example, I showed you the evidence from Shaked Noy and Whitney's Zhang paper. Perhaps we can create human complementarity by using more and more ChatGPT in writing tasks. Actually, that's not going to work. The reason that's not going to work is because, yes, you can make people a little bit better in writing, but if a lot of people start using ChatGPT and ChatGPT does a lot of your writing, that's going to reduce the prices of the tasks that are writing related. It's not really going to generate wage growth. So instead, a conceptual framework and evidence that I provide with Pascual Restrepo says, if you want to use technologies in a truly pro-human way, what you have to do is create new tasks. So here is the Ford Motor Factory, one of their famous plants, Rouge Plant. At the forefront of mechanization, introduction of the assembly line, electricity that's dedicated to specific advanced machinery, but it was at the same time creating a whole range of new tasks, technical tasks for blue-collar workers that required training and put them centrally into the production process. As you can see, that there are as many workers as machines, and a whole host of inspection, design, maintenance, and back office tasks that were going on exactly at the same time as production was being reorganized. As a result, from just a few thousand people, the auto industry rose to employing almost 500,000 people in 2 decades. So the question is, can we use LLMs in this way? And the answer is yes, but not easily, and that's not the path that we're going through. What do I mean by the equilibrium or the unforeseen consequences of better information? So if the role of LLMs is to provide better information, then the question is, how is that better information going to be used? Let me give you one example from something that you could have considered as an intelligent machine, very important, GPS, and it has been super important for many economic activities. But here is one systemic effect that shows what could go wrong. Use it, give it to motorists, and ask them to find the shortest route. Here is going from the airport, from my office to the airport. It's going to send you through all these minor roads. What that does is that it creates a lot of congestion for other motorists on the minor roads. And in fact, the evidence is exactly that when you have GPS systems, minor road congestion increases quite tremendously and to the detriment of everybody. So you have to take the equilibrium effects of these systems into account. Now, that's generally a big sort of set of issues, but in the case of generative AI, I think there are two pillars that are particularly concerning. One is that LLMs, or large language models, are going to create a lot of conformity because everybody's going to get their information from similar sources. So that's going to be what economists call informational herds, reducing diversity, which is going to have systemic effects. The other one, which I'm going to come back to from a different angle as well, is that there could be a lot of further interactions, feedbacks from AI and AI-human interactions, Google, Bard, and Bing talking to each other. But even more so, here is a hypothetical example. I ask GPT-4, is policy as X is effective? GPT-4 tells me no, incorrectly, but then I trust that and I start telling other people, including in social media, so that becomes a training data for the next generation of LLMs. So bad information feedbacks become quite possible, and those are part of the systemic effects. Now, information, that's what I'm talking about. But the question is, who controls information? So in the current architecture of generative AI, large language models, information is going to be more under the control of platforms or foundation models. That hasn't worked out too well in the past for us. For instance, social media is essentially a big failure of how centralization of information together with algorithmic ways of monetizing that information has led to filter bubbles, emotional outrage, viral extremist and misleading contents. And the root cause of the problem is who controls information and what are their incentives. Again, all of these things could get much worse because generative AI is going to massively expand the way in which information is going to be centralized and could be presented or could be monetized. Deep fakes are just, I think, the tip of the iceberg here. I think there are a lot of ways in which on the current business model, things can go wrong. And I think in the medium run, the thing that we really have to worry in the age of generative AI with informational controls in the hands of the platforms is what Hannah Arendt foresaw when she said, if everybody lies to you, the consequence is not that you believe the lies, but rather that nobody believes anything any longer. But of course, democracy and political participation, political cooperation becomes completely impossible in this world that Hannah Arendt foresaw. The last topic that I want to talk about is about human AI misalignment. So this is the most speculative, but it's really, I think, quite a significant issue, which is if machines are going to give us input, it really needs to be aligned with our cognition. But there are major misalignments that you can again see from past technologies. Predictive policing has been a disaster in some ways because police take those recommendations too seriously. So if they're recommended to go and find crime somewhere, they go and find crime there. And that seems to lead to a lot of biases. For example, much greater rates of arrests for blacks, even though the underlying rates of, for example, possession are the same between blacks and whites. Work by my colleagues Nikhil Agrawal and Tobias Solz shows that physicians that are given AI recommended information are misinterpreting them systematically. They're putting too little weight on the original parts and too much weight on the parts that are not actually original and or useful from their perspective. So I think those, again, could get much worse. And I think one issue here is, depending on how human cognition evolves and liaises with large language models, biases could not just multiply, but they could become more legitimized. If I tell you something that's biased, you may not believe me. But if you start trusting large language models, the biases that they have may become much more legitimized. So what's the solution? I think some of this has to wait for the discussion session because I really want to hear what Gary has to say. But broadly, I think we need to use large language models and generative AI differently, but it's not just the use. I think we have to develop them differently. And this is partly architectural, partly application-wise. In some sense, again, many other people are talking about related issues, but we have to make AI more legible, meaning that in a way that's easier to use for humans, much better in terms of its sources, provenance, and reliability of information to help human cognition, much more prone to sensitivity analysis or reasoning exchanges for humans. And also, I think the type of data, as long as these models use low quality data, there's going to be a lot of bad manipulation, whereas the higher quality data is going to get drowned out. I think there are many other parts of this like that I would love to talk about and get Gary's feedback on, like the domain specificity, whether you actually want that or not, and what sort of internal guardrails you can introduce. But I know I've gone on for quite a bit, but let me end with the regulatory part. I think from my point of view, the promise is there, at least as a semi-outsider, but the bad news is that that's not the path we are on. And that path requires regulation. Some of the regulatory ideas that Simon and I suggest in the book, I'm more than happy to come back to it. It requires a very different market structure. Such a monopolized control of information cannot be consistent with the promise of generative AI. And it also requires for us to go back to the more pro-human vision of AI, giving up on being mesmerized with machine intelligence, which I think has become just super exacerbated with the generative AI hype that Nicoletta was mentioning. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Daron. That was a wonderful tour d'horizon on the problems, the challenges, and also the promises of these technologies that, however, need to be, I think, put in check. And I would like to pass the mic to Gary, who's ready and running with this presentation. And maybe, Gary, you can also tell us about the latest 22-word statement that I think you co-signed on this issue, and where all that is going. But the stage is yours. I can't hear you. I think you're muted.
That's the problem of the late 20th, 21st century. Okay, so life is complicated. I just put together these slides. And I've retitled them AI Isn't Over Yet, Nor Yet in the Right Neighborhood or in the Right Place. And I think that fits pretty well with what Daron was saying a moment ago. So here's a brief tongue-in-cheek history of AI. In the beginning, there was hubris. Marvin Minsky in 1967, a colleague in the sense that Daron mentioned at MIT, said within a generation, the problem of artificial intelligence will be substantially solved. That didn't actually happen, but it was okay that there was all this hubris back then because it raised a lot of money and it was basically without harm then. So it was maybe strong claims that raised a lot of money, but not every promise was kept. By 2012, 35 years after Minsky's famous prediction, the problem of artificial intelligence certainly had not been substantially solved. And then, according to popular legend, there were GPUs, and GPUs were good. And the way that the common story goes is once there were GPUs, people figured out how to use them for deep learning, and AI was more or less solved in 2012. Jan LeCun at that time said there's been lots of great results. They're amazing. We're getting this wonderful jump in accuracy. And people then made big promises then too, that machines would be able to converse with humans, which a decade later is sort of like half true, but has lots of problems, as Daron just pointed out, and there are many others we could talk about. People said we would have driverless cars. Well, that's been promised for a decade. It still hasn't materialized. People said we would replace all the humans in factories. That's certainly not the case. And not everybody was convinced. And I'm going to toot my own horn a little bit in the context of this talk. I think my predictions have actually been A, pretty good, and B, frequently been ridiculed. And I'm going to lay one new prediction on you today, and I want you to take me seriously. So I give you a little historical context. So 2012, I said that deep learning was realistically, and this is just after it became popular, a few days after a front page story in the Times about deep learning, I wrote a commentary in the New Yorker, and I said, realistically, deep learning is only part of the larger challenge of building intelligent machines. Such techniques lack ways of representing causal relationships, are likely to face challenges in acquiring abstract ideas. They have no obvious ways of performing logical inferences or of integrating abstract knowledge, such as about what objects are for and how they're typically used. And so I said that deep learning was a better ladder, but a better ladder doesn't necessarily get you to the moon. And I would say for a decade, nobody really paid attention to me, and in fact ridiculed me at times. And I'll give you some examples of that later. I don't mind that I was ridiculed because I think people are coming around to seeing that I was right. So that makes it even more fun, I suppose. Anyway, in 2022, I said that deep learning was hitting a wall. I didn't mean to say that deep learning wasn't making any progress whatsoever, but I said it was stuck in a few places. I said it was stuck handling outliers, unusual cases, that it couldn't really integrate information from basic web searches, that these systems frequently succumb to stupid errors, and that they were prone to promulgating misinformation. All of that turns out to be true, but at the time there was a real backlash when I said it. Especially after DALL-E came out a few weeks later. Sam Altman said AGI is going to be wild a few minutes after releasing DALL-E. Someone at DeepMind said it's all over. AI is basically done. All we have to do is scale these models, make them bigger, and we're all set. And in fact, there became a cottage industry in making fun of me. Some of it was actually pretty funny. Like Yasha Bot had the graphic with deep learning jumping way over the wall. Greg Brockman, the CTO of OpenAI, or president now of OpenAI, made something saying deep learning is hitting a wall, although he should have looked carefully and seen that it said deep learning and wondered what was up with that. The error was actually a sign of things to come. Sam Altman said, give me the confidence of a mediocre deep learning skeptic. And Jan LeCun said, not only is AI not hitting a wall, but with AI-powered driving assistants aren't hitting walls or anything else either. So there was a lot of bravado then, and a lot of pushback against me. And then there's a plot twist. By the end of the 2022, the narrative began to change. So one significant thing is that promises around driverless cars were scaled back. There was a great expose in Business Week saying, look, $100 billion have been invested, and we still just have like demos. We don't really have products here. And then Apple delayed its self-driving car until 2026. They managed to get their new VR thing out, but they put their self-driving car back. And Tesla said, in I think a startling admission, they said their self-driving technology may be a failure, but it's not a fraud. You don't really want your lawyers to say that in court, and that's what happened. And then people started worrying publicly about large language models, including Sam Altman himself. A lot of people worried about Galactica, which came out just before ChatGPT. And there are clearly a lot of risks. In my own Senate testimony, I think I outlined something like 7. I didn't have a lot of time. I could have given more. OpenAI gave 12 in their system card for GPT-4. And then I guess this is last week, but it's actually 2 weeks ago, even after the Senate testimony, we saw some of the things I warned about. I said in the Senate testimony, people would use these tools to manipulate our markets. And then it seems actually to have happened, maybe intentionally, maybe not. When there was...
It'd be good to be cozy.
Someone,
I'm gonna mute.
Someone. Yeah. So we saw a deep faked image actually influence the market. People have been writing about security holes. There are lots of cybersecurity problems. Deep fake video almost faked out Bill Browder, et cetera, et cetera. And then the skeptics' critics, i.e. my critics, actually changed their tune and even stole their metaphors. So here's Jan LeCun, who's the chief AI officer at Meta, who ridiculed me, now saying, taking my own metaphor, you have to take a step. I didn't invent the metaphor, but you have to take a step back and say, okay, we built this ladder. We want to go to the moon. There's no way this ladder is actually going to get us there. And Sam Altman in December said ChatGPT is incredibly limited, but good enough at some things to create a misleading impression of greatness. It's a mistake to be relying on it for anything important right now. It's a preview of progress. We have lots of work to do on robustness and truthfulness. That's almost an exact summary of the 2022 article, Deep Learning is Hitting a Wall, that he had earlier ridiculed. I'll skip that one for now. I have a couple slides about what we might learn about human cognition. I think I'm going to skip them in interest of time, but maybe Daron can ask about it, or others can. But briefly, there are things humans can still do, like abstraction, reasoning, compositionality, and especially factuality, like understanding how things relate to facts that these machines don't really get. I'll actually go into one, the last one. So somebody asked Galactica, which was one of these large language models, to use the words Elon Musk and car crash in a narrative. And it came up with, on March 18th, Tesla Inc. CEO Elon Musk was invoked in a fatal motor vehicle collision. If you read further down, it's saying that Elon Musk himself died in this car crash. Well, we all know that's true, but it's really interesting case. Why is it interesting? Because there's so much data out there in the world that he's still alive. He tweets literally every day. He's in the news literally every day. If there's anybody that we have data for that's still alive, it's Elon Musk. And yet the system said that he was no longer alive. Why did it do that? Because all these systems are really doing is statistical word prediction. If you have the word on, March might follow it. If you have the word 18, March, then 18 might follow. If you have 2018 might follow. It's just autocomplete. It turns out there's a bunch of things out there that have the words Musk, Tesla, and car crash together in discourses. It's just that the people who died in those car crashes are people who own Teslas, and Tesla is itself owned by Musk. But these systems don't actually understand the relations between these words, and that makes them dangerous. Daron made that point in a different way. It's clearly a problem. So where does this all leave us? Despite everything that I've said, large language models do have real and immediate applications. If I had more time, I might talk about the positive side. I feel like that's so well covered that I tend to focus on the negative. There's certainly positive application. They help computer programmers a great deal, for example. But still, they have to be taken with caution. So users of these systems have to ask, what is the cost of error and of confabulating? Because they make stuff up. And can those errors be caught reliably? Societies have to ask, what are the consequences? What policies and regulation, which is what I'm going to talk about in a second, do we need? And the AI community has to ask, how can we develop a trustworthy approach to AI? And I think we're both pushing towards more interpretable models and so forth. And maybe that'll be part of the discussion. How could we build more trustworthy AI? So let me talk briefly about policy. So some of you probably know I spoke on the Senate right next to Sam Altman a few weeks ago. I had been thinking about policy for a little while before that, although I wouldn't say I'm a policy expert per se. In 2017, I proposed that we needed something like a CERN for AI to unify people because we weren't really building good and reliable AI by just leaving things to corporate labs, nor by leaving to individual academic labs because the problem was too hard. On April 18th, I gave a TED talk and wrote an op-ed for The Economist the same day saying the world needs an international agency for AI. When I said that, I didn't think there was a chance in hell that it would happen. Now it actually looks like there's at least some chance that it could happen. Things have really moved fast in the last month. Earlier this week, in fact, Rishi Sunak was reportedly working on a proposal, I think comes out today, for a CERN for AI. So that's really vindicating for me. You might think, wow, this guy should feel super vindicated. But actually what I feel is terrified, and I'm going to tell you why. The reason I'm terrified, actually is maybe captured more in this slide, is I'm worried about regulatory capture. So we are at a moment where I think we might actually get regulation for AI, and I think that's good. But I'm worried that the people in the room are the corporate executives and the government. I was worried about that a couple of weeks ago when Kamala Harris had a meeting in which almost everybody in the room was an executive for one of these companies. And then there was a press release today that made me rewrite my talk a little bit in haste, saying that about a UK AI safety summit. And there were quotes there from DeepMind, Anthropic, Palantir, Microsoft, and a startup might not know called Faculty. And I'm reading from a tweet this morning that really alarmed me. And not a single voice from civil society or academia, no one with the lived experience of algorithmic harms. I thought that was a really on-point tweet. I wanted to bring it to your attention. And this is the worry that we have right now. The worst case is we start having regulation, but that regulation is there just to keep the incumbents incumbent, to make the government say they've done something, but to not really have any effect on what the companies are actually doing. And I don't think we can afford that. We have to ask a question about whether the rubber will actually meet the road. We have people like Nadella saying, hey, we want our systems to be safe, secure, and but they aren't really, and nobody is holding them to that. So just as an example, Microsoft uses GPT-4, but GPT-4 is not transparent. We don't know what's in it. We don't know what it's trained on. We know that how it's trained influences lots of things like bias, both in terms of like if people used it for job decisions and so forth, and also it biases people in terms of their political beliefs. There's some very interesting recent work about that. So here are 5 suggestions about AI policy. And the way I'm feeling this morning is number 5 is arguably the most important, or at least the one we should least forget. So first, I think every country needs its own AI agency. There are too many risks around AI to just leave it to existing agencies, even though I think existing agencies have a huge role to play. But I think we need a coordination of efforts. I think we also probably need an international agency. And I think part of the reason the companies are pushing for this is they don't want to have to train 193 large language models with all of the expense to the climate and cash, for 193 jurisdictions. And we're very quickly headed towards a world where there is no international coordination. And hopefully people in the audience have thoughts on this. I think we also need something like an FDA pre-approval process for widespread deployment. So that pause letter, which I did sign, and we could talk about, called for a pause on a very specific piece of research. But whether or not we pause that specific piece of research, I don't think we should have people roll out models to 100 million people. That makes us actually all unconsenting people in an experiment where our political beliefs are affected by these systems. We also need post-deployment auditing with government backing. We need to actually enforce transparency, not so that every competitor knows everything inside of, say, some product from Microsoft, but some scientists have to be authorized to go in there and test the things and see what the consequences are. And that brings me to the last thing. Scientists have to be involved. We can't even have the optics of more of these meetings where the government is just in bed with the companies that they're regulating. That's just no good. We have to have scientists there. So looking back in the 2020s, and sort of taking my past and going to the future, there's one positive future where we actually get a global AI agency this year. AI starts being thoughtfully regulated. The notion of responsible AI becomes a prestigious profession. We start getting new companies and new tech that actually solve some of these trustworthy problems. AI becomes more efficient in terms of data and energy. AI and finally fulfills its promise and contributes massively to the world, addressing climate change, medicine, elder care, and more, right? That's why we're doing AI. But there is a bleak future too. There could be conflicts inside the field. I mean, we're already seeing evidence of this about whose risk is more important. So some people are like, I care about long-term risk. You're wasting time thinking about short-term risk. And we have people saying the opposite, as if we couldn't care about both car crashes and cancer at the same time. Like, we have a lot of infighting that's problematic. We could get stuck on large language models and never invent a better, more reliable, more efficient technology. It could wind up with a small number of companies quickly becoming far more powerful than states, running the world as they please, shutting out all competition with ill-conceived regulation of their own devising. And that's the nightmare I'm having this morning. We could wind up with cybercrime syndicates and big companies and big drug cartel-like wars. We could have more powerful AI systems that become weaponized, large numbers of people killed in deadly conflicts, deliberate and accidental. Employment could crash. There could be widespread unrest, multiple civil wars. We could wind up with anarchy. So there's also a very bleak future in front of us. The choices that we make now, I think, will shape the next century, maybe even beyond. If we don't have scientists and ethicists at the table, our prospects are not great. We cannot afford not to regulate AI, but we also cannot afford regulatory capture. We have to get this one right. And I would say we don't have a lot of time to waste. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Gary. That was fantastic, and a fantastic compliment to Daron's presentation. And I think I really want to go to the audience some point in 10 minutes or so. But I also wanted to, have you two interact. I think it'd be nice to see if Daron has thoughts about your presentation and vice versa. I may just add a word, being here hosting from the IMF, IEO. Is this, when you talked about regulatory capture, there's a lot of that resembles and reminds of the great financial crisis, and banks setting up their own risk models. We had a seminar before this on gain of function research, which is also faced by the same problems. A bunch of labs that sort of get fancy with increasing the virulence of pathogens for reasons that are well understood to the public, and they're unregulated ultimately, and sometimes they even use public money to do that. So there's a series of challenges. Someone has the mic on. Could put off, or maybe see, because I have to be brutal at kicking people out, and I don't like that. But there's a bit of a background noise. So anybody could check their mics, it'd be great. And then there's the issue of competition in AI development. So I know that I heard on the radio that China has announced that it's also concerned about unregulated AI and some of the dangers of its own developments. Clearly, in a world that is becoming more and more geopolitically fragmented, I mean, this is, creating an international agency is probably not going to sort things out, because large countries are not talking to each other. at the moment. So I don't know if, this is just stuff I throw there so that you can, maybe you can talk to some of that. Daron, do you want to chime in and,
I would love to. I would love to. That was a great presentation from Gary, and I would love to add to the international aspect, but that's not what I'm going to do. I'm going to actually just keep my comments brief and hope that I'll get a chance about international regulation later, because I think it's a super interesting topic. I really love the way that Gary framed things, but I have two things to add, which draw a lot on my book, Power and Progress with Simon Johnson, that amplify, but perhaps also sort of slightly add to what Gary said. And one, that Gary's emphasis was on the use of the large language models, which is super important, and all the guardrails. But I think equally important is the direction in which these technologies developed. So even if we do pretty good regulation on the use, deployment, rollout of these technologies, unless we develop the policy tools to redirect what these models are used for, how they are developed, I think we are not going to get out of the big conundrum that Gary correctly emphasized. So that's why the emphasis of a lot of my work and Power and Progress is on redirection of technological change. And in the case of these large language models, developing them and changing their infrastructure architecture in a way that enables much more pro-human development, which means more complementary to workers, more empowering of citizens and human decision makers. And I don't think we can ignore that, and it has to be really at the center of the policy and the debate. And second, complementary to that, completely agree with Gary that we are trapped in a situation in which tech leaders set the agenda and it's getting intensified. So we need scientists, ethicists at the table, but we also need even broader democratic control of this technology. The technology is going to have tremendous effects on employment, workers, inequality. So how can we make decisions on this without having the representation of labor, some sort of worker voice at the table? Civil society organizations, pro-democracy groups. I think it's not enough just to have scientists and tech leaders. We really need a broader set of voices. So those are the two big topics that I really want to emphasize, and I want to pass it to Gary to hear from him as well.
So I'll just riff on that because I totally agree with it. We need a conscious development of AI, and we have an unconscious development of AI. What we have is there's this tool, somebody developed it in Google in 2017, and it's pretty cool, but people are just running with it without thinking about where it leads. And where it leads is to a bunch of unreliable devices gathering data about everybody, potentially putting us at huge risk, particularly for democracy. A whole lot of negative externalities, like the risk of misinformation undermining democracy and medical misinformation, that are going to be borne by society, not by the manufacturers. The deck is really stacked towards the tech companies right now, using the tool that they happen to have developed, rather than a more thoughtful world you could imagine, where we could say, hey, AI could be useful. What would we use it for? Probably we wouldn't start at the top of our list with advertisements. We might worry more about the risks. We might say what we want AI for is actually scientific discovery. Are we fostering AI for scientific discovery? Turns out large language models are not good at that. They're also not good at transparency. There's a wonderful AI Bill of Rights from Alondra Nelson and others. I think we could all agree on. There's UNESCO guidelines or similar and so forth, emphasizing transparency and safety. The AI that we have is not emphasizing safety or transparency. We're running with the AI we've got, and that's not the AI that we want. To Nicole's question on a different topic about global cooperation, what I often hear is like, China's not going to come to the table. And I can't pretend to predict what China actually wants. But I will say that China is actually ahead of the US in AI regulation in many respects, not all. There's some, human rights violations that I'm not happy with. But in many ways, I think China does actually want some of the same things we want. I was actually speaking at the UN I did a panel briefing, I guess you call it, a few weeks ago, and then 40 different countries spoke. The person from China said the same things I did, basically, which was like, we are worried about cybercrime and misinformation, and we need to have regulation and global policy. So like, I wouldn't take it as a foregone conclusion that we couldn't make some kind of deal. Is there going to be perfect intersection? No. But might there, there's a poor choice of intersection. Is there going to be perfect agreement? No. What a lot of countries want, including China. Russia had a very different statement, I'll just say, at this UN conference. But many, many countries seem, I think, to want at least many of the same things. No rational government should want to cede power entirely to a few tech oligarchies. Like, governments want to stay in business and protect their citizens. And the default here is that our political beliefs are going to be greatly shaped by a bunch of systems we have no insight into. And that's going to take away power from every government in the world. And so that's reason for every government in the world to actually come together and try to do something here.
So we have a bunch of questions in the chat, but I just want to go back to Daron and Daron. So Gary mentioned the regulatory capture, and that's a very real risk. And he put up some pictures and tweets, and it doesn't look that good. And that's something which again extends to big tech and other areas of big everything, right? Big food, big this and big that. But in your book, Narrow Corridor, you do a call to arms for people and societies to move and do things. And I think the letter to scientists that Gary signed, and the more recent short statement goes to that. And this is a call from scientists, including, right? But what can people do, and how could, for example, the IMF, you think, do something about this? Because it's supposed to be public sector organization which has the interest of human prosperity at heart. We do call, as IMF, a lot on structural reforms. We've asked countries to set up fiscal councils, for example, in each country that looks at the fiscal house and takes care of transparency. What's your view there?
So I think this is super important. So let me answer your question and also talk about a little bit about global regulation as well, because I think the two are connected. I think if Gary's and my diagnosis is approximately right, we really need broader engagement with these issues. So the most important thing is for people to get informed and get engaged. And that is an individual choice, but it's a choice that is greatly facilitated by organizations that also get into this space, IMF, civil society organizations, labor movement included. It is in this context that I probably differ a little bit from Gary, that I find the continuous talk of existential risk not as something that's that easy to form a coalition with. I think a broad coalition of concerned scientists, concerned citizens is great, but the talk of existential risk really gets people pacified on some of these issues rather than getting them really talk about the clear and present danger about the current path of AI and the much more mundane damage that it will do. I think if we can form a broad coalition that's still activist on the part of the citizens, that's great, but that's what I worry about, the calls for existential risk. Now, the other role of the IMF...
Let me just interrupt for 1 second there. I didn't sign the existential risk letter, and I also don't think it's well framed. I think that a letter that said there are potentially catastrophic risks here that we should take seriously would have been fine, and I would have signed that. But saying that humans are threatened with extinction is extremely speculative, and the way that letter was written undermined many of the other risks. So I'm not sure there's actually so much difference between Daron and I. I might be slightly warmer towards talking through those existential risks to see if they're real, but I'm basically with Daron there, that there are lots of clear and present dangers that we need to worry about, and something in between of like catastrophic risks where there's a nuclear war that doesn't lead to extinction, but maybe we wind up in an accidental war because of misinformation gets misplayed in some way. We need to be worried about those things as well.
Absolutely.
We don't
Absolutely.
necessarily have to worry about the rest.
Absolutely. I think that way of putting it, and in fact, that's exactly the reason why I did not sign the existential risk, but I did sign the pose letter precisely because even though I disagree with the text of it, I thought the broad coalition that it brought together was very important. And so let me bring that to the IMF. And I think IMF, another very important role for the IMF and the World Bank and the UN is the international regulation of it. So I think we are at a situation where, you know, these technologies could create a lot of damage to workers and to billions of people who live in the developing world. Workers have minimal voice at the table via the weakly functioning democratic process in the industrialized world. The billions of people in the developing world have no voice. Wherever Sam Altman, Elon Musk, Mark Zuckerberg, and other executives decide AI will go, they will have to suffer the consequences. For example, if automation of white collar work becomes extensive, that's going to have tremendous implications on India and other countries that are engaged in offshore white collar work. If these technologies are used for automation of routine jobs, that's going to have major implications, and all of the consequences for their democracies, misinformation, deep fakes, especially, you know, if you see how Facebook was used under somewhat weaker guardrails than in the United States and Myanmar, you see the dangers. So it is imperative that voices of the developing nations are heard, and that's only possible. The necessary conditions for that, definitely not sufficient. Necessary conditions for that is that they become informed. They form something like a consortium, and international organizations such as IMF, UN, World Bank play the role of coordinating and becoming their partners in having their voices heard. So that's the sense in which, and Gary's fantastic idea of a global agency would be a very important part of that as well.
I completely agree with that. I think we should write an op-ed that makes that point. So take note. And we'll add that a couple levers of specific engagement, let's say. One is that these new tools may be directly used to manipulate markets. And I think it's in IMF's interest to take note of such things. You know, the Pentagon explosion thing that apparently moved the markets for 4 minutes is just the first of many things like that to come. And it's going to mean that the empowered people who can afford to run these systems can play a lot of games that are going to cause other people to suffer. And I had a second one. So, well, I'll just leave it at that. I think there's some specific also the ways in which these things can manipulate public opinion is also, again, likely to hurt the developing world as choices are made that probably are going to be in the interest of, you know, the people who run these systems and not necessarily the others. And so it's, again, a place where organizations like the IMF might be able to monitor how are these things affecting marketing, or markets rather, how are they affecting the disposition of money in the world.
I think Mark Carney talked to this in a famous speech he gave years ago. Since a lot of the assets are now under management and they're traded through algorithms, I mean, there's a sense in which, you know, markets have become much more erratic, and the reactivity of markets to news is much stronger. I want to read a question here from the audience. Is from Otar Gorgotzi. It says, to both of you, I think, why this time is different from an economic perspective? How is this distinct from any other technological advancement, like the invention of a calculator? I think Daron, at the beginning, he went through some of the history of this. I think this is what externalities and market failures AI regulation should address. So kind of taking a step back, and I think people maybe not too familiar with what AI is. Spend a few words there, Daron.
Yeah, I would love to answer that question. Thank you for raising it. And this is essentially the raison d'etre of our book. It's actually, this time is not different. The same forces have played out in many of the, almost all of the major transitions. In all of them, there was a tendency for elites to take control and use it in ways that were beneficial for them and not necessarily beneficial for others. In many of them, when automation and control of information was enabled, it did not work out so well. So medieval technological breakthroughs were fairly revolutionary. They did not create benefits for peasants. The first stage of industrial revolution created poverty, wage stagnation, much worse working conditions, worse health for the British working classes. Things changed only when there was democratic control of how the economic process works, trade unions, and much greater electoral democracy in Britain. And the direction of technology became much more targeted towards greater new tasks and other things. And so, and we're seeing exactly the same thing in the early stages of the digital technologies as well. There is one aspect in which AI is a little different, and it is that, when you think of the steam engines being used in the coal mines in the British Industrial Revolution, yes, that was horrible because it enabled workers as young as 5 or 6 to work 18 hours pushing carts with their heads deep down in the worst conditions that you can ever imagine. But it was only one sector. AI is much more pervasive and it's going much faster. So I think we need to learn from history, but probably worry about safeguards and speed of progress and regulation even much more, because things are changing at a speed that we haven't seen before. But the struggle over technology and who benefits from it is extremely common, and I think we can learn a lot from the history of how we got this right sometimes and wrong many times.
And I think, listening to you and to Gary, I think that maybe one very different thing is that before machines used to save us energy, and now these machines are trying to think for us. We don't even understand how they think. And so that is kind of dangerous, because then, if they are connected to the internet, they can take decisions or, implement actions that, and that I think where people are, getting very scared. There's a question, maybe Gary thought about regulation as well, can get to this. Could we put a tax on innovation development so the regulators can get time to get on top of the issues?
A tax buys you money; it doesn't buy you time. I signed the pause letter because I think buying time itself would actually be a good idea. And I'll give a more extreme version than the pause letter. The pause letter said, let's pause for 6 months on the development of one specific technology. I have a friend, a psychologist, evolutionary psychologist, Jeffrey Miller, who wrote a very strongly worded tweet that's probably silly, but really sets up a context. He said, let's just hold on this stuff until we understand how to control it, until we're sure that as we cede power to it, that it's not going to cause a disaster. That's all reasonable. The last thing that he said was very arch. He said, and if that takes a few centuries, so be it. Let's wait a few centuries until we build this stuff and know that it works and it's not going to cause chaos. And that seems really extreme, but it does raise the question, why are we rushing forward when we're really not very sure what the consequences might be?
I think I totally agree, but I think it's not that we are rushing. I think it's some people that may profiteer from this are rushing, and and that's
well. But as a society, our elected representatives have a couple choices. One is to have cushy photo opportunities with the leaders and say we're doing something, and the other is to say, we're actually going to hold you to things like transparency, and it's nice that you came and visited our offices, but we're going to play ball. We're going to play tough here. That's what we need.
So I think here there's a question on so regulation on social media, and that didn't really work well. And what's the relationship, and how can we compare lessons learned, on trying to regulate social media, and what's going on in AI, which is, again, and then both of you, I think, maybe Gary's.
I can start. The first thing is we just took too long. Second thing is there were people who gave darker warnings that were not listened to, and we need to. It's not that the people with the darkest warnings are necessarily correct. You probably want some nuanced and balanced view, but you have to take seriously the people with the darker warnings and figure out how you've actually addressed them. And I don't think we did a good job of that with social media. And then I think you have to have post monitoring to figure out whether it's working. So now we know Section 230 is causing harm, but nobody is doing much about it. We know social media, for example, is causing teenage girls all kinds of problems, and nobody's doing much about it yet. And, things get stuck in committee and their politics and so forth. So, paying more attention at the outset, moving faster, and watching for errors and doing course correction more quickly. Part of the reason that I've pointed to something like an AI agency is we don't want the senators there saying, I wonder how different GPT-5 is from GPT-4, and how should we revise this specific law. We need some kind of agency that can move faster, that has the expertise and can say, okay, on this one we didn't quite get it right, let's recalibrate here. And so the agility and speed is another important factor why I keep pushing towards national and global governance.
Well, this is going to get boring, but I completely agree with Gary. But let me amplify it further. I think the problem of social media is completely inseparable from the business model of social media. And we are just doubling down on that business model. So social media has a very specific business model, which is based on making money by controlling information and then monetizing it by turning it into individualized digital ads, which creates all of the speed need, expansion need, emotional outrage need, attention need. Now, I think it's also a great example of what Gary exactly said. If Facebook had a different business model and reached 1 billion model users, 2 billion users a little bit more slowly, in 50 years' time, would that have been a terrible thing for humanity? I mean, I can't imagine any scenario in which in 50 years' time people would have said, oh, it was terrible that Facebook reached 1 billion users only slowly. So the question is, how can we change that? I don't see any way of changing it without appropriate policy. So, for example, one of the policies that we advocate in the book is digital ad taxes. The current environment is such that subscription models or non-profit or semi-profit models like Wikipedia cannot compete against Facebook's or Google's digital ad tax model. So then you have to tax the digital ads. And that's going to have a lot of implications about the direction of research, how they develop these models, and so on. And I think that's one of the dimensions that I think is going to become very important. But the broader type of regulation is very important. Again, Gary sort of touched on this. Google perhaps acted responsibly for once in its history by not rolling out its large language model in 2022. And then OpenAI, Microsoft did it, and they gained hundreds of billions of dollars of market value and created damage for Google's market value. So that shows that the unregulated market system is really creating distorted incentives. So we have to fix those. Thanks.
The IMF has itself set up just recently. It's working on digital strategic things for world economies, but is actually recently put together an AI working group. And if you were chairing that group or part of that group, what do you think could be the two top things that that the fund could do a start with there? I'm sure some of these people are in the audience, and we talked about structural reforms. We talked about banning some of these things. Countries might consider delaying adoption, and certainly there are probably methods of doing that. I know that, for example, our school, it ChatGPT-4, it's banned for usage, and it's already been. And Noam Chomsky notoriously defined it, high-tech plagiarism, but that's the language part. I think more generally, is there a way to embed this into economic regulation, aside from taxing, and is there a stark way to go, which is you would suggest the IMF, the World Bank could go or start thinking about? Where would you start?
One thing that I've thought about that might fit in your world, although I don't know your world super well, is this kind of FDA-like process of regulation. So basically require the companies to do a cost-benefit analysis each time they roll something out new to a large number of people. Say, one of those analyses could be economic. What is the economic impact here? Is it simply going to add to oligarchy? How is it going to affect other constituents in the world if this thing is rolled out? How is it going to affect democracy to the extent that the IMF can speak to that? How is it going to affect markets? Are these new techniques going to be used to influence markets in unfair ways? And you have to make a case that the benefits of your system outweigh those costs to market fluency, to inequality, and so forth. And to the extent that you could do anything like that with real teeth, I think that would be a real service to the world. And I'd be happy to advise on that.
That would be great.
So let me just add to that. So here are three very specific policies that the IMF can explore, and then if they like it, play the role of exploring it further with policymakers and advocating it. One is a digital ad tax that I mentioned for reasons I explained. Second, in line with also some of the issues that Gary said, subsidies to specific development of innovations. We would not have gotten out of the fossil fuel trap. We're not completely out of it, but we would not have gotten out of it at all if people did not demand cleaner energy and governments did not provide subsidies via a variety of channels for renewable energy. So we have to do that for better uses of AI, more human, more new task, more empowering uses of AI. And then finally, the issue of data. Writers Guild strike is showing just one facet of this, which is going to become much more common. Creative data of knowledge workers in the past. Who owns that? Right now, these tech companies are expropriating all of that data, and it's adding to their profits, and it's adding actually to a path of using these technologies in a low quality, low road way. So I think regulation of data, ownership of data, data unions, I think those are all topics that should be explored.
Thank you so much. That's very insightful. I think it's great food for thought. There's one last question here, and then I think we should close because we're getting very near our closing time, and I know you guys have things to do. So it's a question from Galen Sharon, says, assuming that AI, I guess this person means AI development in the direction that we don't want it to go, cannot be stopped, how to adapt to it? We need changes to labor market policies, welfare systems. I prefer the more optimistic view that we can shape and craft AI in the way we need it and not just succumb to it. But certainly it is a possibility. So if you have any thoughts.
I mean, I would go with Daron's suggestion and what you just said implicitly, which is to subsidize better AI. Let's not be fatalists here. The AI we have is one possible cognitive set of tools among essentially an infinite set. And this one's not working out that well for humanity, in my view. And there could be others that are better. And if we have a tax that subsidizes more trustworthy AI, we can get to a better place. And if we don't, we won't.
Yeah. Absolutely. Let me second that and say that, of course, we should think more holistically. But one problem with, for example, policy proposals or such as universal basic income is that they are defeatist because they are often presented as we have to do this because there is no other way, and lots of people are going to be pushed either into very low wage work or into joblessness. But I think that is not a future that we should accept, and there are different paths, and seeing these different paths, if necessary, slowing things down, and preferably, I'm not in favor of blocking innovation. I'm not in favor of slowing down innovation, but if necessary, that's one of the steps that you take in the path to redirecting technological change. And I think there are really many, many opportunities there for redirecting technological change. We just don't know which ones are going to work because this is a very fast-moving technology. It's a very complex technology. Take the GDPR, General Data Protection of the European Union. It had exactly the right instincts. It was talking about exactly the right set of issues. It has not worked so well because there are many reactions of the industry, and there are many complexities. So we really have to experiment with many regulations. So it's super, super important in my mind not to be defeatist. We have to be very activist in trying different regulations, developing the muscle for regulation and activist policy in the government, build much greater human capital, technocratic expertise within the government that is comparable to at least some of the tech sector so that they can actually play the role of regulation, understanding, and reaction to these technologies.
And in doing that, also bear in mind what Gary said. So make sure that these technocrats are not subject to, capture, because that often, then you end up that job and you continue your profession in one of these industries, and that should be, that should be controlled, because we know what happens in other areas. But there was a lot of people participating today. Your presentation were amazing. I learned a lot, and I hope we can continue this dialogue. The AI is moving very fast, but I think if people engage and are aware of the risks, as well as the good stuff that can come of it, we can all shape the future to be better for ourselves, or for our children, and for future generations. So thanks so much for being here with IEO.
Thanks for having us. I'd never done an event with Daron before. We'd only met each other via Twitter. It was super fun to do this and see the way in which we aligned. And thanks very much for hosting. It was great.
Likewise, fantastic event, and thanks, Gary. Thanks, Nicoletta.
We'll talk again, and I'm sure we'll get in touch again to pick your brains on these matters. Thank you so much. Thanks everybody for being here. Thank you. Bye. Have a great day. Bye.
Take care.